I think it's 1 o'clock. Welcome back. We are here at the Building an Equitable Arts Infrastructure Symposium at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm not going to reintroduce everything and re-thank everyone other than to say hello again and thank you again. My name is Derek Miller. I'm chairing our session today on data and story. And thank you for joining us here and online. So let me explain how this symposium session is going to work, and then I'll introduce our subject briefly. So first, our four panelists and I are going to introduce ourselves and describe our personal relationship to the pursuit of equitable arts support. Or, as I said just before we began, tell us why you think we thought you should be here. Then we'll speak for about 6 minutes each on the main topic of our discussion. Then we'll have an open conversation within the group for about 20 minutes with panelists responding to each other. And perhaps if time, we'll be able to take a question from someone. And finally, each of us will speak about how we might actually go about building more infrastructural equity in the arts. So we'll aim to just solve everything in an hour and a half. It's a tall order, but these are very good people. So a word about our topic. The digital turn transformed some aspects of arts creation and labor, and it also inscribed the arts as data. Examples of the former consider how the increasing prevalence of moving lights has changed stage electricians' work, or how AI may, and in some cases already is, fundamentally redefining writing. Arts data is our main focus this session, but what's arts data? Data about arts is generated by producers and stage managers. It's generated by grant makers and government employees. It's generated by artists and by audiences. And that data can both show us artistic inequities and can itself be inequitably gathered, analyzed, or reported. So we asked this group a few framing questions, and I've resynthesized them a little bit from how they're printed in the program, to this. First, how do data and technology contribute to resource parity or disparity in the performing arts? And two, what narratives are data and technology producing that might encourage us to make the arts more equitable? So now we'll turn to the introductions, and I ask everyone on the panel, we're going to say our name and affiliation and discuss our commitment to equitable arts infrastructures. Shall we start at the far end of the panel with Brian?
Good afternoon. So my name is Brian Eugenio Herrera. I am an associate professor of theater and gender and sexuality studies at Princeton University. I'm housed in the Lewis Center for the Arts, which is an interdisciplinary unit that houses programs in dance, visual arts, theater, music theater, and creative writing, with music being its own department, but also a participant in that. So I feel like my institutional location is also a very interesting infrastructural model for thinking about how the structure of higher education can and does and might yet engage with the interdisciplinarity of arts practice as a fundamental thing. I am by disposition and training a historian, and my work has typically dealt with the presence and absence of Latine peoples in U.S. popular performance, mostly mainstream popular performance, so like mainstream, like commercial television, film, and theater. I also have been working for a number of years on a project about the history of casting, which is in some ways fundamentally a question of structures of labor management. And so I think those are why they want me here. I'm also a kind of pull my string and I'll talk kind of guy, so that might also be part of it.
I don't know how to follow that, but I will try my best. Hi, everyone. My name is Martine Key Green Rogers. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the Dean of the Theater School at DePaul University. I am also a past president of the Literary Managers and Dramaturgs of the Americas. I am president-elect of the Association for Theater and Higher Education. I'm a freelance dramaturg. I currently sit on the boards of Oregon Shakes as well as Red Twist Theater in Chicago. I also just finished up a fun moment of service as the co-chair for our new VP for DEI and belonging at DePaul, as well as also I sit on as the sitting dean on the committee for free speech and expression at DePaul. And so if you couldn't tell, I spent a lot of my time in service to arts and arts education communities, and I'm really thankful that I work at an institution in a sanctuary city in a state that has doubled down on its commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I mention this because I've spent a lifetime committed to anti-oppression and race and anti-racism, and I feel like in this specific moment, it's very important for those of us who are able to continue to do the work, the good work, to help out our colleagues in places where the work has been eradicated abruptly and unceremoniously. And so I am interested and committed to the intersections of where marginalized and underrepresented communities are able to thrive and make brilliant artistic work as part of the discussion about equitable and robust arts support. And also, I do that Shakespeare thing when I'm not doing all those things. So, so I think that's why I'm here.
Hello. I want to thank everyone, just to echo everyone's gratitude to all the organizers and especially graduate students who are helping here. So my name is Esther Kim Lee. I am professor of theater studies, international comparative studies, and history at Duke University. I'm also the director of Asian American and Diaspora Studies at Duke. I'm a theater historian, just like Brian, and I have written books about Asian American theater and history of Asian representation in theater. So my first book, History of Asian American Theater, is based on over 70 interviews that I conducted with Asian American actors and producers and directors. So that was a great opportunity to kind of learn about what actors and playwrights and other theater artists actually do on the ground. I try to write my book in a very accessible way. So I write my books for theater artists. My language, I hope, is very easy to read. And that's been kind of a life mission for me. So, and also kind of partly because of my advisor, whenever I used academic jargon, he used a really bright red pen and said, "Don't do this." So, and I think, so that's been kind of my, in a way, my activism, and to really kind of support and tell the stories of theater artists. My latest book is Made Up Asians, Yellowface During Exclusion Era. And I mentioned this because this panel is partly about technology, and in that book I talk about how makeup technology was used to exclude Asian representation and also to perpetuate Asian exclusion during that era. So I am here because I'm really good friends with Charlotte. But I will be focusing my comments really on kind of the area of my research, which is Asian American theater.
Hi, everyone. I'd like to thank everyone and all organizers and UT to provide this great opportunity for me to meet all of you and share some of the work we do at SMU Data Arts. And my name is Wenhua Di. I just joined SMU Data Arts as a research director 5 months ago, so I'm super new. I'm also a research professor in arts management, they call it that way, and I have a joint appointment with the economics department at SMU as well. So before I joined as Data Arts, I worked as a research economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas for over 17 years. And I also consulted with a few organizations doing economic consulting. And my previous academic research focus is on studying consumer and small business decisions on financial services and products, and look at fair access to financial credit and the impact of policy and programs on the access by various populations, and especially the underserved populations and communities. So when I saw the job posting for this research director, I thought I could contribute with my experience in consumer studies and financial studies and program evaluation to understanding of the arts sector and strengthen the arts sector with data analysis. That's my background and super new, and I'm here because they invited my boss, the director of Data Arts, and she's not able to come. So, so I'm lucky. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Derek Miller. I'm a professor of English at Harvard, where I teach courses in dramatic literature and theater history primarily. I am a theater historian as well. My research, one strand of my research, is driven by data, quantitative-driven studies of theater history, but also by law and economics. Those are the sort of the three pillars of the research that I do, most of the research that I do. I spend a lot of my research and teaching in one way or another thinking about the scale of theatrical activity. Where does theater happen? What kind of theater happens there? Who makes it? Who sees it? Who pays for it? And why do those people do all those things? So as a theater historian, what I try to bring to conversations about equitable arts is historical context. So it's easy to say theater is in an equitable field, or the performing arts are an equitable field in X way. But often when you look at historical data, you'll find that those inequities fluctuate, or that they come in many different forms and flavors over time and in different contexts. And uncovering that history can help us sometimes in a few ways. One, it can make change seem possible because now you know it wasn't always like this. Or it can make change seem a little more practical because you know more about the different forms that inequities take, and therefore, as you're thinking about trying to create more equity, you know what to look out for and what kinds of traps you can fall into that maybe aren't going to solve the problem you're trying to solve. I think that's the hope for what I contribute to those conversations. Also, I just really enjoy the opportunity to be in the room with people who are producers, directors, writers, actors, all advocating for trying to make the work that we do better, easier to access, and more fun? Is that a thing we can say? Can things be fun? So we'll shift now to our main topic, answers to our questions. Maybe we'll go the other way down the table this time. How about that? We'll switch things up. It's crazy around here. How do data and technology contribute to resource parity or disparity in the performing arts? And what narratives do data and technology produce that can encourage us to make arts more equitable? So, there are so many examples of data and resource disparities in the arts, data as a resource, disparities in the arts. Two that come to mind really quickly, and I'm not going to delve into them. One is archives and digitization. There are various efforts underway to try to help institutional theaters archive their work. There are various efforts in place to try to help individual artists archive their work. It costs a lot of money to digitize that work and make it accessible to wider audiences. Those resources are also hard to distribute in an equitable way. And so that's an ongoing conversation. I've seen pieces of it as I talk to the curators at the Harvard Theater Collection or learn from folks at other institutions, including here at the Harry Ransom Center. So that's one place we can look to those disparities. Another is the way that data and grants tend to have a positive feedback loop. Grant-making organizations often want to hear about your data-driven reasons that you need the resources or data-driven evidence that you've achieved your goals on your previous grant and therefore can move forward. It takes resources to create the data to show the impact or to do the planning, and so getting started up in the virtuous cycle of data and grants is another place to think about data and inequity. But I've got three different examples, and two of them come from the commercial theater, but I want to spend most of my time on those, because I think one thing that's tricky when you have a big capacious topic like this. I mean, implicitly the conversation in the previous section was mostly about nonprofit and grassroots community organizations, and I think in some way that's really where it's where I'll speak for myself. It's where my heart is when I worry about equity and infrastructure. But I've done a lot of my research in the commercial space, and there's so much crossover. I think it's hard to find individual artists whose careers don't intersect with the commercial space in a fathom of hundreds of different ways. So I think that's something sort of a meta question for me right now. So three examples. The first example is dynamic pricing on Broadway. And this is a story, oddly enough, of resource parity from data and technology. So as I'm sure we all know, the audience, the house, has always had scaled pricing. Like, it's hard to find eras of Western dramatic history where people are not charging more for you to sit there than they are for you to sit there or there. So the house has always been scaled. Around 2001 on Broadway, they add premium seats, which seem like a big breakthrough. And in some ways they are, because they help productions break into the secondary ticket market. But they're not really a conceptual breakthrough. All they are is creating extra high top prices for a small section of the theater right there about halfway back in the orchestra. What really changes things on Broadway is actually around the 2010s. First, it seems to be happening in Disney, and I have a theory that they were doing it before anyone knew they were doing it. And then other producers began adopting the practice. And they get it from the airline industry, and it comes from the business science known as yield management. And it's called dynamic pricing. You're using constantly updating information. It doesn't need to be live updated, but even if you're updating it weekly, but you're using constant information about demand for specific performances to adjust the pricing in different parts of the theater. So you're sort of, almost running sort of almost a live auction of what's going on based on how much demand is coming and going, on performance date and time, on where you are in the orchestra, on seasonal patterns in the price scales during those periods, and all that kind of things. And if you go look at tickets for a show, you will see versions of that in action. Some productions lean into it harder than others. If you go to sporting events, you can really see that in real time in the way they sell seats for their events. Surprisingly, as best I can tell from my research, dynamic pricing has actually increased financial equity among Broadway productions. It's made it easier for a show to make money, or at least to earn more money than it would have otherwise, whether they're extremely successful or only moderately successful. And honestly, even if you're a failing show, you're going to earn a little more back than you would have under the previous model on average. So that's a story of a new data-driven system and technology that's being applied that's actually increasing equity in the commercial theater sector a little bit. Second story is about narrative from data, and it's about looking at counting the numbers of black performers on Broadway. So there's been, of course, a lot of awareness, particularly in the past decade, about the extreme racial disparities in casting in theaters around the country, and a conversation about that on Broadway, too. Performers on Broadway are still majority white, but Broadway has not always been as pervasively white a space as it was, particularly in the 2000s and 2010s, before this conversation became more in view. Various data on race and Broadway casts shows us that a higher percentage of black performers appeared on Broadway in the 1920s, for instance, than in the 1940s or 50s, which were, again, more unequal. And we can also see that the 1970s were a relative high point for black performers on Broadway. Each of those errors, including our own now, includes larger numbers of black artists, but under different circumstances. And by that I mean that the artists are thriving in different kinds of productions, ranging from black cast musicals to multiracial dramas, depending on the era in which they're being produced. So when we talk about what would Broadway look like if it looked more like the United States, or even the globe, or even New York City, we should be thinking about the kinds of productions and the audiences for those productions and the creative staff for those productions that have also previously enabled black artists to occupy a significant place on Broadway. And of course, there's a then larger multiracial conversation too. That's a more constrained history. Last piece then is about narrative data and data or resource disparity. I'm trying to synthesize them. Let's see if I succeeded. It's about how theaters have used Twitter. So in 2019, I did a study of theaters that had social media accounts and then focused on Twitter. I looked at theater communications group member theaters, just to have a specific set of theaters to use. And what I found was, this is very sad when you conduct research and you're like, I'm going to say something amazing. And what was amazing was there was nothing interesting to say. Theaters did not use Twitter in 2019 in an interesting way. They advertised tickets for their current shows. That's all. There was really little creative engagement overall. They were just selling. It was sort of Twitter as a billboard was the model. Now, modern social media, especially after Twitter's collapse into X, offers opportunities for theaters to take a leap forward in how they use social media as a promotional space, but also as a community building space and as an art making space that flows back into the work they're doing as producers. And there are theaters doing this. I don't want to say this doesn't exist out there. But whoever really figures this out becomes a theater that has a true social media identity and presence, is going to have, first of all, a first mover advantage in terms of becoming a new kind of venue. But more importantly, it's possible that the kind of engagement that's going to need to be developed is going to be expensive to develop and then to maintain. You're going to need different kinds of expertise to have social media spaces be artistic and community spaces than you need just to sell tickets online. Especially if the social media work is integrated into a theater's production work in a real meaningful way. So in that case, you're going to get a new kind of technological inequity, theaters that are able to adopt the new social media model and theaters that aren't. And But maybe theaters won't ever figure out how to use social media in an interesting way. Maybe the billboard model is really the best they'll do. But even that billboard model is likely to get increasingly inequitable as online advertising depends more and more on the ability to analyze and use large swaths of consumer data, another set of potentially costly and thus inequitable production tools. So those are three examples from my research of ways that data and technology, contemporary data and technology leads to changes in equity in the theater world. And with that, I will turn to our next speaker.
Well, that's super cool. 2 examples of using data. I'm going to continue that to share a little bit of what we do at SMU Data Arts based on my 5 months learning. So SMU Data Arts as a research center, data is really essential. So what we do is first we collect data firsthand through this signature product called Cultural Data Profile. And this is a partnership with grantmakers, as Derek just mentioned. We built a platform for grantmakers to collect financial operation data about arts organizations, their programs, their finances, their staff, and their space. And then there are like 900 variables in the data set over 15 years of time. And that's our own data, and then we provide this to grant makers so they could evaluate organizations' performance and then how they're going to use their grants and so on. And then we integrate the data with some other source, like private source data, like ticket sales from consumers of arts, performing arts. And then we also integrate with census data, with funders data, and the project data. Through our partners. So for some of the service organizations, for example, Opera America and Chorus America and League of American Orchestra and a few of our major partners, we also collect different type of deeper, more deep dive data with their association and address some of the issues they are particularly interested in. And then we integrated all these data and geocode the location of organizations and consumers. And then this way we could potentially link with other sources and provide insights for arts organizations, grant makers, and researchers about the industry, about the field. And so there are a few things we mainly do. One is to provide trends and pattern analysis and research to inform the organizations and then the users, and to make strategic plan, to make decisions internally and externally, sometimes do advocacy work. And another thing what we do is to create some tools with these data. For example, we have models to calculate, to assess the vibrancy of communities. I don't know how many of you have heard of Arts Vibrancy Index. We publish every year for communities across the United States. And then we, using a factor model, and then we also created a few sophisticated tools. One is to level the playing field of arts organizations with a stochastic model, and then to control for the environmental variables, and then to identify the intangibles of arts organizations that are not easily measured by organization characteristics or their environmental factors or funding environment, and such as the arts leadership and decision making, and then some of the network effects that are not, we don't have a consistent metrics. And that is a tool that we use to identify high performing arts organizations that can level the playing field, because we control for a lot of other things that we can observe. And other tools include like market intelligence tools and to help organizations to discover how to engage their audiences. And there are other methods that we developed to understand audience inclusion, to understand the difference of the audiences from their communities, and then look at the factors that can affect the audience inclusion. For example, the funder types, funders different types, like amount spent on engaging audiences. And then there are also a lot of, because we have this data set, we could leverage it in many different ways. We thought it would contribute to our goal of equity in infrastructure, because essentially we're providing this unique data infrastructure to help equalize different organizations in terms of their storytelling capacity. However, as Derek also mentioned, there is a variety in the capacity in terms of data collection. And then there are organizations who are not able to fill out these forms, these surveys consistently over time. And then we have lots of attrition in the past few years, especially since COVID. We once had more than 10,000 organizations completing our CDP, but now we're close to 3,000, so it's a huge drop in recent years, and that really jeopardized the quality and the consistency of the data. And then we are streamlining our instruments right now, hoping that we can retain the responses, and then to keep answering some key questions going forward. And we also are worried about losing some of our existing partners, because they want to see the whole picture of some of the, like a lot of variables in the survey. So that is one thing. And then we do have some really interesting tools to leverage this data. Recently, my colleague, Daniel Fauner, he came up with a machine learning AI model to evaluate the fairness of grant making process after the grants are made. So this way, kind of putting into goals, missions of grant makers, and then evaluate after the grantees are determined, to see the process if they actually meet the goals of the grant the funders and some other equity goals. So that is one project where we're currently getting a lot of attention, and then we also receive like an NEA funding for that. And overall, I mean, there are really ways to contribute to equity infrastructure. At the same time, also, we are noticing a lot of disparities across organizations in using data-driven way to tell their stories. So I'll stop there.
Apologies, I have to use my laptop. So I am going to give you 4 data points. Speaking of like non-expert, that term from the last, I'm a non-expert when it comes to data. So I am looking at data from perspective of a theater historian who specializes in Asian American theater. So it's more kind of my kind of random observations and kind of what I'm observing. Okay, so the first data point is that according to the 2020 census report, Asian Americans are 6% of the population in the US, and 7.2% if you include those who identify as multiracial. So I give you that number, 6% or 7.2%, because I talked to a social scientist about hiring someone who specializes in Asian American studies in the social sciences and at an unnamed institution. I was told that they would not be able to hire someone in that area because the sample size is so small that any data they collect will be invalid. In other words, they cannot study Asian American population because the sample size, again, is very small. That means that the margin error will be larger. They would have to oversample any kind of polling they do, but that will be costly, and no nonprofit organization would be willing to do that. So I've been kind of sitting with that thought. Okay, if the 6% is too small to sample, like what can we gather about them? Like what can we learn from that kind of like lack of data or this kind of invalid data? So that's one kind of point that I've been thinking about. Number two, Asian Americans, including those who identify as multiracial, are fastest growing group in the U.S. Fastest growing. That's been true since the 90s. So that there's a kind of sense that they're small, but they're growing fast. Okay? And the third point is an article. I'm going to read you a bit from it. This is NBC News, May 1, 2024. Headline is that most Americans can't name a famous Asian American. And a quote from this article, it says, the majority of Americans can't name a single famous Asian American, according to a recent survey. And for the fourth year in a row, the most common answer, besides I can't think of one, was the actor Jackie Chan, who's not American. Okay. And this is based on a report released by the nonprofit Asian American Foundation. It was a survey based on over 6,200 people above the age of 16 in the US. And then lastly, this is a report from the McKinsey consulting company. They are basing this report on many surveys and data analysis, especially of kind of population income and spending. And it says, the title is From Margins to Mainstream, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in Hollywood. And I'll quote, Asian American and Pacific Islander consumers could generate billions of dollars in additional revenue if the film and television industry can improve the representation and authenticity of API content. And they base this argument on kind of high income bracket of many Asian Americans. So according to these kind of 4 data points that I've kind of shared with you, so Asian Americans are a numeric minority. In the US, they're largely invisible in this kind of imagination of what American is supposed to be. Yet there's a lot of potential, both in terms like number and kind of growth of number and then probability based on their representation. So I'm really fascinated by this pull between invisibility and potential. And I think that really captures my view of the Asian American experience and Asian American expressions, including theater. So what does this mean? Like, what are we to make of these data points that describe this population that exists somewhere between invisibility and kind of potential, or what I think of as like lack of immediate presence and legibility? There's nothing kind of immediate here and now, but something about it could potentially, there could be something in the future, but right now they're invisible. So I want to quote something from Stephen Yoon, one of my favorite Asian American actors. And I think this kind of really echoes what I just described, this kind of lack of the presence and kind of visibility. He says, sometimes I wonder if Asian American experience is what it's like when you're thinking about everyone else, but nobody else is thinking about you. And he gave this quote while he was talking about the Netflix series Beef, which is about Asian American rage. Right? That rage, again, comes from this lack of kind of visibility and voice. So these are some of the issues and questions that the Asian American Performers Action Coalition, or APAC, some of you may know this group, tried to address. And this is a group that was formed by Asian American performers in theater, so Broadway, off-Broadway, off-Broadway, to increase their access to representation, especially in New York stages. And I'll give you a quote from their kind of history, how they articulate their history. APAC was started by a group of Asian American performers who came together in the summer of 2011 after this question was posted on Facebook. Where are all the Asian actors in mainstream New York theater? The flood of comments elicited by this question could not be contained online. It quickly became clear that Asian American performers felt we were largely invisible in the mainstream and that this was getting worse, not better. We at APAC took on the responsibilities of organizing forums for the artistic community to discuss minority representation in New York's theater and garnering statistics from the 2006 to 2011 theater seasons to see whether our feelings were validated by numbers. So what they decided to do besides running forums and symposia, they started to gather number of like how many of the roles in New York on New York stages went to Asian American actors. So they have this data from 2006 and on, and they ended around 2000, like around COVID. So they've been publishing annual reports about this. So in, for example, in 2011-12 report, they have this pie chart that shows that 79% of roles went to white actors, where only 3% went to Asian American actors. African American actors took 14%, Latino actors took 3%. So this kind of number kind of stays similar, kind of like 3 to 4%. But around 2016-17 kind of jumps, almost doubles. And the last report was kind of published in 2020, but it was about the 2018-19 season, showed 6.3%, which is a huge bump, and that kind of parallels the overall US population. So they have not published any data since then, and I don't know if they're still active. And I think the goal was, I think, very, to be praised, that they were able to kind of connect what they're feeling and validate it with data. I think that was necessary. And I think that did give sense, kind of like this kind of legibility and this kind of countering the invisibility, that data provides some sort of visibility for them. But I think it also reveals a lot of limitations on data gathering. Because if the ultimate goal is to gather data, like what do you do next? Like what do you do? What do you do with, like, by the time you get to 6%? Okay, are we done? Like what do we do, right? So I think this kind of I've been thinking about this, and then I was really struck by this one passage in the report, the latest report they've had, and it really was a response to this kind of Black Lives Matter movement, and kind of the around like 2020, that a lot of kind of efforts in New York City to include more BIPOC artists. And this is a conclusion they included in their kind of introductory summary section. And this is what they said. We've been fighting for a seat at the table, but now we realize this is minority thinking. We must be part of building a new table. So I'm thinking, how can data help in building a new table? Or can it help? Is it this kind of positive loophole that Derek was talking about? Like, what is the next thing, right? And like, has this kind of goal been articulated by people that really can do something about it? I mean, like, how do we, and again, like that begs the question, how do we communicate this goal to them? And I'll end with this. I'm a theater historian, so I've been studying activism, especially by Asian American actors, to improve their representation. And say in the 1960s and 70s, they picketed shows and all of that stuff. And that's the way they express activism. But if you went to 1950 and looked at Broadway, and if you did the same kind of data study that APAC did, and then I would guess you see almost 20% representation of Asian actors. Why? Because that was an era of what we call kind of Oriental fad. That's a kind of a musical theater. We're talking about King and I, the South Pacific, right? A bunch of musicals, not principal actors, but a lot of chorus members, and like a bunch of people were hired. So do we want that? I don't think so, right? So activists in the 60s and 70s fought for better representation. They were not just fighting for inclusion or visibility, it was better representation. But when you're just focusing on data, then what do you do? Like that whole kind of more contextualization of quality, not quantity, right? That goes away. So I'm just questioning like what's next after that. How do we build a brand new table?
All right. Back to, I don't know how to follow that. So I'll start with smushing my identities as a dramaturg and a dean. So I'm going to approach the questions from this panel from that way, and also sort of bringing in a higher component of technology as well, since I think that's something that really matters in the way that I'm looking at our curriculum, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, so I'm really interested in the intersections of technology and the arts, and part of the reason why is that AI is now a foci of the strategic framing at DePaul right now, and although it is not an area of focus specifically for the theater school in our strategic plan, we are finding more and more that our students and our prospective students are asking about our engagement with AI, like how are we using it in our classrooms? Are we using it in our classrooms? If we're using it, in what way are we doing it? And ironically enough, a lot of times when I find myself in those conversations, I end up saying things like, well, really, my personal engagement as a dean is using Suno to create a trip hop song about a dramaturg named Martine. Which, by the way, is actually pretty good. The beat was hot. So part of the reason why I'm bringing all this up is because I feel like as we start to delve into these, and I hope I don't end up being like the lady who's kind of the Debbie Downer in some of this conversation, I find that all of the technologies in which I am going to sort of evoke as I speak have both upsides and downsides. So they both bring parity and also disparity simultaneously, depending on who's using them, why they're using them, what was the thing that was driving that made someone make that thing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, and so I'm going to try and pull on all those threads as I go through these things. So, for example, I think about educationally about platforms like Digital Theater Plus, mostly because, especially during the pandemic, especially just even before then, now, et cetera, one of the things that was so lovely about that platform was that it allowed whenever I was working somewhere that didn't necessarily it wasn't necessarily always like a theater desert, but didn't necessarily have a whole lot of options for our students to go to. It allowed us to bring live, even if it's filmed, performance into our classrooms and our spaces, and to really engage with it. And if we were somewhere, I always think about my time as an instructor, as a professor at SUNY New Paltz, where it was only an hour bus ride from our school down into the city to see things, versus when I was at the University of Utah, where that, if anyone knows anything about the theater scene in Salt Lake, it's its own beast that defies definition, and we're just going to leave it at that. And both good and bad, just defies definition. One of the things that I like to bring up, just to illustrate what I'm talking about, I'm literally just opening the surface of this, is that I remember there was one time where there were 3 different productions of Les Mis happening in Salt Lake City at the exact same time. But the reason why that was allowed to happen is because you know how normally most cities won't, no one who's licensing these things will allow that many productions. The reason why is because the theater scene in Salt Lake is so very specific, and people only go to very specific theaters that they know espouse their values. And so that is why a thing like that can happen. And so I took my students to go see 3 different productions of Les Mis, mostly because I wanted them to see what are these cultures. Anyway, I digress. But it's interesting to me because I think about software like Google Drive. One of the things that's amazing in the way that I see it manifest in the storefront scene in Chicago is that it allows smaller theaters, smaller art organizations, the ability to organize themselves in order to be able to disseminate information in ways that you don't see happening at Steppenwolf or at Goodman, because they are using more paid platforms in order to do these things. Google Drive allows people, on a sort of smaller level and on a smaller scale, to do things for free. But you also have to look at the flip side of that, which is what happens to that data? What is the how much data, how much space do you have before then all of a sudden you have to pay for things, or you have to worry about losing things, or you have to worry about all these other things that could in some ways start to affect the data keeping capabilities of these smaller arts organizations. Where does the archive come into risk? as people have to dump files in order to make space for the new thing. Those are things that I'm thinking about. I'm also thinking about who can afford the technologies and access to degree programs that allow you to access things like Digital Theater Plus. And then to get back into something that Michael said a little earlier. Wait, Michael? No. Derek, sorry. Said earlier, I was also thinking about access to grants. And look, I know I'm opening up a huge can of worms right now because we all know that the granting system is just like a hot mess right now for a lot of different reasons. But I also think about the disparity that comes with not being able to keep archives, and then what happens when you need those archives in order to be able to apply for funding. These are all the sort of things that I am thinking about. I also think about social media platforms and how algorithms influence. And just so you know, this is what my brain does every day as a dramaturg and a dean. So just know this is the chaos of my brain every day. But I'm thinking about how we use social media platforms in order to tell our story, but then also how some of those things are also in some ways ephemeral, in the sense that once, let's say, we've all probably been there at some point where you've had to create a whole new social media platform because something happened to either your password or whatever. And especially in organizations where people move on and then they take something with them, and then all of a sudden no one has access to that thing anymore, and then you have to start all over. And so I'm thinking about a lot of those. And also, let's just be real about this. We can go down massive amounts of rabbit holes, whether you're on one side or the other, about how algorithms are biased. But then what does that mean about exposure to some of the things that would allow for parity to happen, but usually ends up leaning into the space of disparity? And then I'm also thinking about just a relevant thing that's happening right now, that the theater historian in me, but I'm a theater historian that leans theater theorist. So I feel like I love sitting in between Esther and Brian right now. And I'm thinking about what's happening at Congo Square right now. I don't know how many of you are following what's happening at Congo Square in Chicago, but the long and short of this, and this is a very reductionist version, so please go down the rabbit hole and find out more information for yourself. But essentially, there is a labor dispute between admin and the artists, and when those convos broke down, there then came the deletion of artistic data and history from their websites, from YouTube, etc. And so now artists who have poured their heart and souls into short form content that was living on YouTube and that was living on Instagram, all of that gone. And so I'm also just thinking about, still, as much as we talk about data collection and our leaning on technology, and sometimes the way that it is very easy to also destroy that archive, that is something that is in my brain. And I'm thinking about what does that mean for those artists? And everyone always says that archive lives somewhere, but you also need to have the ability to be able, you have to have access to whatever it is in order to get it. You also have to know how to how to access that thing. Because I think also about technology, most of our platforms now, in order to even create a website, means that most people don't need to know how to actually code anymore. And so then what happens when you don't have those skills, and then all of a sudden you want to try and retrieve something from the annals of what has ephemerally happened in cyberspace? So that was a lot. But and then the last thing I kind of want to bring up, so this is mostly the musings of a troubled dramaturgical mind, but I'm also thinking about what Todd London brought up a little earlier in the earlier panel, because he brought up a good point about institutional support and databases and what happens when that falls apart. Because I'm also been thinking about that a lot, because the Congo Square situation is a good example of that. There are other examples of when platforms that require constant investment and constant upkeep are then sort of left to atrophy. Then all of that data, then what happens to it? Where does it go? How do we, and then especially as technologies change, especially if it's atrophying while technologies are changing, what happens to that archive? So that was me and my brain. And thank you.
So thanks, Martine, for concluding on an archival question, because in some ways that's sort of where I start. I've been thinking today, as I came in and when I got assigned data story, I was like, I guess I'm on the story side, because as a historian, that's sort of what I believe my job is to do, which is to sort of evince the stories of, and I've come to understand that a lot of what I do as a historian in my work, didn't plan it this way, but a lot of what I do is sort of evince, sort of building off of the earlier definition we got on infrastructure, of evince the embedded structures, embedded supports, and to sort of make them legible and understandable. And what I realize is that I have found myself pivoting. I love that we were thinking about melodrama as a moral story. We were thinking about the evangelical belief that undergirds the notion of mission. But also I've been thinking a lot about the two articles, one article of faith and one article of neglect, I guess, that I feel like I always encounter, which is a peculiar phenomenon in the US arts of the last 100 years, which is the article of faith that overdetermines most artistic practice, is the belief that if you build it, they should come. Maybe not that they will come, but that they should, that the making of art is as a worthy good of itself that deserves as part of its existence and audience. But then its complement, which is, somebody will archive it, what I call the archival afterthought, right? This paradox of purpose, but also a sense of thinking in the now and the next, but not thinking the next involving the past. And so, but that also listening to Caritha this morning, it caused me to reflect a little bit about my own experience as a teacher. When my first job in the academy was I was a conventional theater historian. I taught the theater history survey from caves to cats in 2 semesters, the whole thing. And then when I shifted gears and went to the job I currently have right now, which doesn't have a theater major, I realized that my courses always had lots of people because it was a major requirement. And suddenly I was in a place where I had to be a theater historian, where I had to attract people to take my courses as an elective, which is a shifting of just sort of how do I frame my courses. And what I began to understand, in addition to my interest in being an arts observer, I began to understand the relevance of my practice as a historian as being a historian of the contemporary or current moment. And what ended up happening in my teaching is I ended up developing a series of courses that we now call the ecosystem courses. These are courses that carry titles like Theater and Society Now, Movements for Diversity in American Theater, Reimagining the American Theater Canon, and the one that I'm currently developing right now called Performance and Policy, all of which were designed to think about very much introducing our students to the contemporary context of art making, prioritizing that as a subject worthy of study and fluency, but then also thinking about it in sort of activating historical imagination or curiosity, thinking about how the initiatives for diversity are not just now, they trace back 100 or more years. And so all of which means that I have been reading data projects of a variety of different kinds in my research and elsewhere as primary sources, which is not necessarily how they're used, but how they've been, how I've encountered them. And so these arguments that often will come in the surveys of contemporary popular culture and popular performance saying, there's an untapped market here, is a pretty familiar story. This idea of if we put the numbers together, that will reveal the fact that there is something not mission aligned with what these theaters are saying they're doing versus what they're actually doing. And so there's a kind of a belief that data itself has a narrative of its own and is transparent, which is why I feel like I can point to about 5 different studies from the Annenberg School talking about Latino presence and absence in television and film that tells basically the same story. This is a huge untapped market, represent them better, and maybe they'll pay more. Like, it's this weird paradox that's recurring. And so I think part of what we have is a lot of assumptions about how data means. Especially as artists, and so to think about what is the value, and I think that comes from the fact that we assemble data often as advocates, often as a space coming from a space of rage or frustration, just saying, where is the information? I know there were I taught a whole class was undermined by the fact of the pandemic, where we were attempting to develop a data set of Latine presence and absence on and off Broadway in New York City from 1990 to 2010, and we were using optical scanning and machine learning. We were doing all this stuff, and right as everything was starting to cook, March came, and so the course just sort of went off the rails, and I couldn't figure out a way to get it back because I didn't have this particular constellation of students. But it is this question of like, and the animating question was, I asked them, so where the Latinos at? Like, just trying to find where they are, to evince them from invisibility, which I do think is an infrastructural thing about how data works, because part of what, as historians what we do is what we look at the arts data that is left behind, and there's so much that is elided or evinced or erased or destroyed or fallen away, and we have different techniques of reading sideways and reading the stories based on the fragments that we have, and that's indeed a fundamental method and technique of our field. But I do think that part of what I am increasingly alert to is the fact that there are embedded structures of historical cycle and also historical narrative that we tend to think of as individual. And so it becomes a kind of an analytic whack-a-mole where we think these are isolated, but in fact they're either discursively connected or structurally connected. One of which is the one that I'm on sort of the course I kept thinking about trying to teach to see if I could use the course as a way to think through this, was what I have come to observe as sort of a 30-year reset in the American theater industry that traces back to the 1870s. Like every 30 years, the way the American theater operates as both a sort of a performance practice and a commercial practice undergoes a traumatic reset. 2020 was one, 10 years on either side of that. 1990, 10 years on either side of that. We heard Todd talk about both of those moments when there's and then jumping back. And so there is some questions that I think sort of a macro and micro dynamism between understanding data on the micro level and also understanding data patterns on the macro level, which is in some ways what we as social historians do, but that's, there's not a lot of us theater historians. There's a lot, we're overrepresented on this panel, but there's not a lot of us in the world. And so there are opportunities we have, but we are generally developing these data sets for ourselves from our own accidental, adventurous, creative research techniques. So there's a way in which evincing the data, of figuring out what the arts data that is left behind can tell us, not only about our immediate topic, but about the ecosystem more broadly, remains stories worth telling. And one final thought, I have to invoke James Baldwin, who did, the final play that James Baldwin was working on was thinking about a lot of the questions that we've been talking about today, and it was called The Welcome Table. So there is the idea of a table that is bigger, that can be inclusive of us all. And again, as always, like, look to the ancestors. They've often been wise all the way along.
Thank you all for those wonderful and really different comments, really different approaches to thinking about these questions. Thank you very much. I was trying to synthesize some things, but I think I totally failed. So feel free to ask or just answer a question you wish someone had asked on these topics generally. But something that came up in a few of the comments that were made were the question of where's this data coming from, who owns this data, while you were talking about that. Martine, you were talking about Google Drive and things like that. So as we're entering a new era where, oh, heck, why not? I think there's a greater suspicion of malice in coming from both the federal government and larger corporations. I don't know, maybe it's always been malice from large corporations. But how do we think about the options in coming years to continue to generate, store, and analyze arts data if we can no longer rely on the federal government to be either producing accurate data about their surveys of arts populations, and also large corporations. To the extent we were able to trust them at all with any of the materials we're storing on Google Drive and things like that, what are some alternatives that we might be thinking about in coming years?
Can I actually complicate that too? Because one of the things that's catastrophizing. That's my thing. One of the things I was also thinking about that I had debated about whether or not I was going to say is that I think also what's going to happen, and what I personally worry about, is that as we find that we may be moving into an era of malice, when do people stop wanting to share? And so then all of a sudden the archive is now internal because no one wants to share because they're worried about what's going to happen to it if they do let it out. And so I'm actually wondering, on a larger scale, like, is there a way, and I honestly don't know because I feel like, back to, I love technology. The Capricorn in me is like, yes, bring it on. And also the Capricorn in me is like, oh no, I can see what also is going to go wrong with this. Or maybe that's the dramaturg in me, not the Capricorn. But either way, like, how do we, when people don't want to share anymore because they're worried about what's going to happen, how do then we still manage to extract data that is accurate and not have to worry about that? So anyway, I know I'm complicating it, but that is another thing that's swirling around in my brain. I don't have answers, just complications.
I wonder if there are any roles that these unions can play. I mean, there are like 40-some unions on Broadway. I'm thinking about all the wonderful videos of Broadway shows that are sitting at the New York Public Library that are not accessible, right? I mean, like they're just amazing shows that I wish I could. I mean, so because of Actors Equity Union rules, policies, and other unions, you're not allowed to show those videos. So I'm also thinking the other end. Like there's a little bit of kind of gatekeeping, both kind of from like a macro kind of federal, like for corporations, and then also there's kind of internal gatekeeping that's going on with this archive. And I hope that these unions are having some conversation about how to strengthen their artistic freedom to be able to share their work, but also to be able to make it more accessible. I mean, I think those are such essential questions, and they're interlinked.
Well, I also think that one of the complicating factors is we are Digital Theater Plus is one key example, Broadway HD is another, where when you look to see those shows, you realize most of them are not Broadway productions, but they're actually the UK stagings, because the UK union protocols protecting and providing compensation for actors and technicians are much less fortified than the unions in the US. So there's this question of what is, and I do think what we've seen at the NYPL, which does rely incredibly on a sort of an invisible funding structure to even create those videos, has relaxed a lot of the protocols. They've leveraged into digital preservation technologies so that watching the recording doesn't damage the recording, so that means you don't have to have a verifiable research reason to see it. They haven't been able to do the licensing. So I do think it's a matter of being alert and also saying we want workers to be compensated for the labor when a film production for which they were not compensated continues to circulate. But it's also worth knowing that when we see the SpongeBob musical production that's available freely on Amazon Prime, that was made, just as the Hadestown live shot that is being made this weekend, that's being made in the UK because the UK regulations are much less artist-centered. And so there's a balance there. I think that is when we're dealing with a collaborative, infrastructural, interdisciplinary mechanism like theater, we're actually talking about what came up a lot this morning, what Caritha's conversation pointed us to, where are the moments of dynamic collaboration that opens possibility rather than just sort of gets through the roadblocks? Because I think what we've seen under the current curatorship at NYPL is they found some workarounds against the obstacles recently, leveraging technology but leveraging advocacy. And so I think it's worth being alert to where we're seeing the kind of creative thinking and leadership and partnership that is opening up some of these impasses, which are so deeply entrenched.
This is fascinating for me to learn, and as an outsider, I like to share some of the reflections. As an economist getting into arts field, and then how do I think about the data here? Actually, I'm going to give a presentation next week at our econ department to their faculty and students. They have been waiting for several months for me to give this talk about what are the opportunities for them to look at our data and then do research. So this is something that I've been constantly thinking, but I want to be ready. And then so I'd like to share some of my reflections today, and some might be relevant to what the questions you have asked. How do we do with the data? And others might be, thinking about what Brian just mentioned. Like I think of alternative way, or think about the assumptions. Think about think outside of arts field, and then what we've learned. And then this morning, Adam also mentioned that. So one thing I noticed is the variation across different arts organizations from our data, by sector, by genre, by size, by location, by mission. And then it's so hard to find consistent metrics to benchmark, to understand, to actually scale up the analysis and insights. So this is the big challenge. I try to tell the story, but how? Because every organization, artists are so unique, and this is one thing that we always combine data analysis with interviews, more in-depth exploration in our study. But then this is the beauty of the mixed methodology. So not just data, but also we want the context. We want the, all the other stuff to tell the story, to actually understand what's those intangible, what's not measurable with data, with numbers. And the good news is that with the current technological change, a lot of narratives, the qualitative information become more, could be hard data too. If you heard a little bit about large language models and all of these AI tools, they are actually starting with these language narratives, and then they could find hundreds of thousands of dimensions, similarities, and then can distill the information. So this is a hope for all of us as a sector to use this new development to provide new form of data to tell the stories. This is about the variation. And then also I want to talk about the dichotomy of consumers and arts organizations. So this happens in every sector, not just arts. So we now have these technology, these digital innovation, which allows consumers, buyers to have so much more variety, so many choices, so many options. And this provide, it's improve the well-being of consumers. And we are all consumers too. But then at the same time, as producers of arts, as producers of any goods and commodities or services, we think about how to grab this opportunity to think about what kind of how we leverage this newly developed interests and preferences and the shifts in tastes and how to cultivate that. And this is something I think we could also benefit from the data, from some timely feedback from the audiences and from the marketing tools in order to understand what is relevant now to the current generation, to the majority of the audiences today. So that's the dichotomy. A lot of times it's harder for the producer, for the production side. But then it also offers opportunities. And the third thing is the implication of technology and data on the labor market. And this is something that I had interest way before I joined Data Arts. And the transformative technology has pervasive influence on every sector. And again, the bad thing is the labor market get disrupted. A lot of people will have to be reskilled, retrained, or learn new stuff in order to adapt. And many may not be able to. But then on the other side, the boundaries between industries and occupations are blurring. And then there are opportunities for creative workers to have other, way to build their financial, stability, and then to offer value to other, to other professions, other, I guess, opportunities. So this is also something I feel like when we think about the changes in how the technology and data are doing to our society today, I feel like I don't know. I think there are a lot of positive side of it too, and then we I have like a whole list of like 20 research questions I want to tell these econ students to study because I don't have time to do it. But because I'm so new in this field, I just discover all these opportunities, and that's very exciting. But at the same time, as an art service organization itself, like Data Arts has its very, like kind of immediate challenges to stay alive, like to be able to produce good quality data and rigor in the analysis in order to, serve the industry and the arts and culture. Like I'm just hoping we open this up to more field, like more researchers to help this sector as well. So that's my take.
Now that I've listened to all of us respond to Derek's question, now I'm wondering if maybe part of what I needed to do is think about this from a dramaturgical perspective, because one of the things that I think, for example, dramaturgs do really well, and I'm sure that all of us also do this, especially those of us who are practitioners, or even those of us who are scholars, like what the necessity of the personal archive is now like sort of bubbling in my head about how do we combat some of this in terms of answering your question, Derek, because, part of me wonders, like, I know that even though I rely heavily on technology in order to create my personal archive, because that work I'm always continuing to come back to, I'm always also updating my technology. And I know this is an access thing, so I'm just going to go ahead and put that out there. And no, I'm going to put it over here and just leave it there. But back to the access thing, I continue to upgrade my technology in order to keep those archives going, and then transferring things over to new data platforms when that needs to happen. And so I wonder if in this moment where we wonder about what's going to happen to our data, what's going to happen is like 10 years from now, the scholars who will be sitting in this room 10 years from now having this conversation will be pulling from our personal archives in order to piece back together whatever the story is of this moment. And that's what I'm thinking about.
That's lovely. One thing that came up in a number of the previous comments was another question I had, so maybe I should have asked that one. Because maybe there's more to say there's a lot more to say on this. The relationship between the live performing arts, and qualify everything there, and the televisual media remains, in my view, still competitive, still uncertain, and still coming with a lot of fear from people who are in the live performing arts industry. And I think it's exemplified by the stories we tell about the Theater on Film and Tape Archive at the New York Public Library and the way that's been operated for so long, not without great effort on the part of many people to try to make it more open access. But how deep is this problem? It didn't get resolved with the advent of film and the development of the motion picture industry. Television didn't make it better, though that was a strange moment for live theater in a lot of ways. There was live theater on television all the time. And social media, we still just have no reckoning or no relationship between these media. How do you think about that role there? Good, there, Brian, go.
I do think it's worth thinking about the televisual as not as a distinct media, but as a mode that is retroactively relevant for the entirety of the 20th century. So because cinema arrived before television, there tends to be a notion that cinema preceded it, but actually cinema as one televisual language, to think of it as a televisual language, like this idea, what now is, because most of anything that you can watch moving on your phone would be televisual vocabulary, right? And that supplanted in certain ways what might be argued the dominant vocabulary of the 19th century arguably would be a novelistic, sort of an immersive prose-driven one. And I do think we are in the 21st century, and social media as a part of this is in what is an interactive immersive modality. And so each of those present different archival challenges. Each of those present different questions of what data is relevant here. And I do think the fact that you were talking about dynamic pricing, thinking about Disney, my old argument is that if you want to look to what technology is happening, you look to porn and Disney, because they're ahead of the curve in terms of what the next wave is going to sort of permeate. And so, and I'm not lucid enough in video games to see if there's a corollary there, but I suspect there is, right? But I do think that is, I do think the question of what is the data there? What is the data in a prose-driven culture? what is the data in a televisually driven culture, and what is the data in a participatory or immersive culture. And so these open up very different questions, and also open up very different questions of one of the key questions, I think, if we go to data as trace, which is a way to connect it to the archive. Data is information that's left behind and is retrievable. If we think of data archaeologically, that's what we're talking about. If we think about data geologically, that's what we're thinking about. And if we think about that in terms of a performance register, what do these performances leave behind that can be understandable, can be, if we go back again to the definition of infrastructure, can be understood to evince embedded or otherwise illegible structures or systems?
So I think theater and any live performing arts have been under threat of kind of mediated or televisual expressions. Like every time there's a new form of kind of dramatic storytelling that's in a different technology, people, kind of call for the end of theater, existential threat of blah, blah. It's not going to happen. Theater is going to go on. I mean, it's not ever going to die in any ways, like Dionysus, the god of rebirth and also of theater. I mean, we're all gonna, be born again, despite all the threat. But I think that I want to kind of frame this question a different way. That is, when are the live performing arts most powerful? That's when it's live, right? So we're asking this kind of paradoxical question, like how do you archive something that is not going to be archivable, right? We cannot ever archive that moment. And then let me just give you one anecdote, and I would love to hear what others have to say. But I just finished reading Han Kang's Human Acts, who just won the Nobel Prize in Literature. And there's a scene in the novel where, because it's during military dictatorship, that the play was basically like tethered to, like nothing but censors who just like blacked out everything. The play is nothing; it's just shredded, and there's nothing there. And then the assistant gives to the director and says, "What do we do? We can't do the play. The play's totally." And he's like, "We'll do it, right?" And the play is described is silent. It's all enacted, and it's the most powerful because all the characters are dead, right? And that moment, that live moment, is to me like the most powerful moment of the novel. Not only novel, but like it really exemplifies the power of live performance. So that's really the most difficult question, I think, for us is like, how do we articulate this importance of live performing arts in the era of like hyper archiving, hyper digitization, right? Where everything is stored, everything is like works with algorithms. So yeah.
And I think I would just say that one of the important reminders is the metric or the metaphor of live only makes sense in a mediated era. And so what we're talking about, the durability of performance's value as a community practice, sort of goes back to the question of co-presence and co-convening more than the idea of the live. That the live, as Philip Auslander has argued, sort of, and I think very convincingly and enduringly, is a metric that emerges with the arrival of moving pictures. And so when we're looking to name the thing that, because I completely concur with you that what we study when we study theater and we study performance is not going anywhere. And it's not ever going to be motion capturable, like with little green dots on your body that then can be, it's never, there's something else, which is where I think performance historians who are very good at discerning the trace, where there should be no trace, are in a particular position to activate new senses of what can data be in understanding the value of co-convening, being in co-presence, gathering in space and time without necessarily a text or a camera to give it meaning.
We have a few more minutes here, which I think is the right time to offer everyone a chance to make some kind of closing remark of whatever kind they like. I think the prompt is again a question of sort of trying to call forth a future for equitable arts, to how we might manifest infrastructural equity in the arts. What can we do? What will we do? And please take that as you will, as a sort of prompt for a concluding remark of some kind.
I'm thinking a lot about how theater practices our capacity, not simply for empathy, not simply for these of coming together in community, but also rehearses our capacity to listen with our fully embodied presence. A fully embodied practice of listening is something very powerful, and that gives me hope right now.
Thank you.
I don't know if there's anything radical about this, but I do think it's a manifestation, and at least in terms of a social way of thinking about arts infrastructure. Maybe what I'm going to put out there is a challenge for all of us that also includes myself, to say the next time we go see a piece of liveness, how are we recording it?
I think the question is such a difficult one because the future is even more unpredictable than ever. And I think the title we have, the equitable arts infrastructure. Like, what if we substituted arts with human, right? Equitable human infrastructure. It seems like that's the existential fight we have in this country. So it's such a again like our kind of being, like what it means to be human. Like those questions are being asked. I was raised in a country in Korea where it was a military dictatorship, where like your sense of worth was always questioned. So I'm like familiar with that, but this country may be heading towards that direction. So I think it's more essential than ever to ask these questions, but not just the arts are not just going to be. This is so obvious to all of us, but entertainment or escapism, but it is going to be an existential battle. And I hope that we can return, I mean, this goes back to earlier in Corita's comments and such, but to the local, to the community, right? To connecting with the human-to-human embodied learning, embodied kind of communal experience. And also, God, I want to go back to what Todd said. The very first thing he said was despair, right? Embrace the despair, take risks, could just do what artists do, which is just press those sensitive buttons that make other people crazy.
Well, I don't even know what to add to that. It's very powerful. I mean, yeah, hold on to the despair and, get the emotion, expressed. That's very helpful. I think human interaction is going to stay. I mean, it's not going to be replaced by technology. But then, again, as an outsider, I feel like some of the issues have been addressed and thought about in other disciplines, and then there are opportunities for artists or art organizations and leaders in this field to also explore collaboration and partnership going forward in some of the immersive experience, like touching experience sometimes comes from interdisciplinary collaborations, like with neuroscientists, with a lot of other fields. So I think there's still a lot of hope. Thank you.
The reinvocation of despair puts me in mind of another ancestor, a recent ancestor, the legendary advocate and dramaturg Morgan Jeunesse, who one of her concepts, one of her portmanteaus was rispair, which roughly, as Gwendolyn Alker defines it, or captures Morgan's definition, which is the willful, even tenacious seizing of joy out of the jaws of despair. That is rispair.
I have two weird things to say. The first is, as we're looking ahead, I think, to where there's going to be a even bigger divide than there usually is between the commercial and the nonprofit theater in terms of the kinds of art that we're seeing from them. I think something really that seems really simple that could happen is if the Broadway brand would take in some of the nonprofit theaters and include them as part of the annual season that they're considering for awards and promotion. I think the relationship between what's really been an incredibly vibrant few decades of playwriting in American theater and Broadway is still very complicated and weird and strained. And so rebranding might be a way to help bring more consciousness to the playwriting that's going to happen in the coming years, when it might be even harder to do challenging work. The second thing is also weird. I'm thinking about my life, sorry, which is wonderful in so many ways. And we, as a culture, have come to a point where we spend a lot of time in our institutions doing work for each other to demonstrate our accountability for processes and procedures. It's a lot of writing. I was the scholar Merve Emre came to talk at my institution a few weeks ago and mentioned, academics publishing work is not private work. It's just a smaller, more specific public than the general audience. Private work, though, are all the things we write for each other inside our institutions, all the forms and documents and reports. And I didn't get my job because I was good at writing forms and documents and reports. If you get to do administrative work, they keep you on because you're better than the other people at doing it. But it's rarely why most of us get into the work that we do. And the more time we can make for each other to just do the work that we want to be doing in community with each other, which is so hard in the 21st century, the better. So one of the things I'm thinking about is the sort of mismatch between the kind of things that I actually study, which is the massive amounts of data produced by bureaucracies and other organizations, and the fact that all that work is in service of another goal that those people have, but it's not the same thing. So in my own life, I'm thinking about ways I can try to cut back on some of that sort of procedural paperwork, archival production, and be more in the moment with my friends and my community. And that includes going to the theater and the symphony and concert dance and clubs and rock concerts so I can feel even older than I am. It's great. So I'm trying to find time for those things. So that's where some of the things that I'm thinking of. And now I'll hand it over.
Hi, everyone. My name is Michael Sietwe, and I am a member of the research group. Let's please, I know we just did it, but let's thank them one more time, the wonderful panelists we just had. In 35 minutes, we're going to begin our next session on capital and resources. So that's going to be at 3 p.m. Central Time, 2 p.m. Mountain Time. Please join us at that moment. So have a good break. See you soon.